With the Italian campaign all but won, Napoleon left the mopping up operations in the capable hands of Guillaume Brune and André Massena, and then headed back up to Milan. There he spent a few days and nights, controversially attending a mass at the Duomo. By June 25th he was returning home, reaching Turin on the 26th. A stream of letters preceded Napoleon's return to Paris. From Lyon on the 29th, he rejected plans for a triumph held in his honour, but largely so that it would not interfere with this year's Fête de la Fédérée. For though the revolution was over, the commemoration of Le Vainqueur de la Bastille was still a powerful and symbolic event, and by not hogging the limelight, Napoleon could cleverly link Marengo to the auspicious event. Sure enough, like a southerly wind, Napoleon swept into Paris unannounced in the wee small hours of July 2nd. As day broke and the government resumed their work, ministers and politicians were shocked to see that the first consul walked among them, quipping that he was glad to see they'd been so busy while he was away. The Fête de la Fédérée was the grandest ever seen. Official ceremonies dominated the open spaces of central Paris, smaller unofficial ones taking place everywhere else, including the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where the old Bastille once towered. Near Les Invalides, Napoleon surveyed the return of the consular guard. Quite literally fresh from the battlefield at Marengo, the guard carried battle trophies and captured standards, and still clad in their tattered, blood-stained uniforms, the obvious connection to Napoleon was made. Though no one begrudged him for the victory, that the war dragged on at such cost soured the day's mood. There wasn't time to dwell. For Napoleon, the next few months, from June to about February of 1801, were so chock full of reforms, edicts, debates and meetings, that in order to keep everything straight, I'm going to have to pass things out a bit, going topic by topic. This was the period in which Napoleon anchored the civic and legal pillars of a post-revolutionary Napoleonic France. The best place to start is with Napoleon's mending offences with the Catholic Church. Relations between the French Republic and the Catholic Church were, for reasons we've explored, extremely poor. The revolutionaries had promulgated a slew of anti-clerical laws in France, the centrepiece being the civil constitution of the clergy, which suborned the Gallic Church to the state. And it didn't help that the church's land in France had been seized by the state. Napoleon too had pissed off the Pope by expanding French influence in Italy, and as we saw after inciting revolts and building an anti-French coalition, the Papal States were invaded first by Napoleon and then by Berthier in 1798. After the fall of the short-lived Roman Republic, the Papal States had been reinstated in full, and with the French return to dominance in Italy, Napoleon believed it high time for a more permanent arrangement. He was helped by two big changes. Firstly, in Rome, the staunchly anti-revolutionary Pope Pius VI had died, and was succeeded by the more moderate Pope Pius VII. The second change was that Napoleon was now first consul, and he could bloody well do whatever he wanted. So as per his ongoing policy of ralliement, he considered it imperative to soothe tensions between church and state. To that end, he began to make it known that a change in policy might be coming, with some public meetings held with church officials. During the Marengo campaign, when Napoleon was in Milan for a week or so, we saw that he was very busy. After attending the opera on the night of June 4th, and sleeping with its headline singer, the luxurious Giuseppina Grassini, Napoleon met with local priests. Together, they agreed on the preliminaries of a lasting religious peace. Napoleon assured them, "It is my wish to meet with you to be able to inform you in person of my sentiments towards the Roman, Apostolic, and Catholic faith. Convinced as I am that it is faith alone which assures happiness to a well-ordered society, and that strengthens the foundations of good government, I assure you all that at all times and in every way I shall endeavour to protect and defend Catholicism. Have no alarm at the manner by which the late Pope was treated. The misfortunes of Pius VI were partly due to the wretched intrigues of his advisers and the cruel policy of the Directory. When I should be fortunate enough to discuss with the new Pope, I shall remove every obstacle that may remain between the reconciliation of France and the head of the Church." As we know of his own views on religion, Napoleon took a very pragmatic view. He followed the belief, or lack thereof, that most closely suited his goals. At the meeting of the Council of State, Napoleon expressed his ability to don different religious cloaks. "It was by becoming Catholic that I pacified the Vendée, and as a Muslim that I established French rule in Egypt. It was by becoming an ultramontane that I won public opinion in Italy. If I ruled a people of Jews, I would rebuild the Temple of Solomon." The social utility, the moralizing influence of religion, and more specifically the promise of an afterlife, Napoleon believed able to moderate some of the baser instincts of people. Quote, "For prisoners and slaves physical restrictions are imposed, for enlightened people moral ones. In furtherance of order, always order, Catholicism would be rehabilitated. There would be no return to the ancien regime, mind. Church and state would remain separate, but no longer in opposition." None of this would be popular back in Paris, though. On the way out of Italy, Napoleon attended that mass in Milan, a move which confounded some of his political allies. They would continue to be confounded as secret negotiations were conducted between a papal legation headed by Cardinal Hercules Consalvi and a French delegation under Joseph Bonaparte. The French offer was this: a full reinstatement of the Gallic Church's rights and freedom of worship, as well as amnesty for non-juring priests. In return, Joseph demanded the first consul be able to name the first French cardinals elected to the College of Cardinals. It was also expected that Pius VII would support the French in Italy, or at least refrain from conspiring with the Austrians. Quibbling over the exact details would continue for the next 2 years, without the official input of the legislature or even the Council of State. Napoleon would tolerate no interference. The bow was tied on the Concordat in July 1801, and generally speaking it favoured Napoleon. He gave ground on a few issues. The unpopular Republican calendar was dropped, and archbishops appointed parish priests. Catholicism too was the only tolerated religion. Protestantism and Judaism were not technically protected. In exchange, the Pope rendered unto Caesar that which was Caesar's. Napoleon gained a subservient clergy. They swore an oath of loyalty to the state and delivered its decrees and communiques. Moreover, despite some serious back and forth, a return of church lands was never seriously considered. The approximately 10% of France that had belonged to the church in 1789 would remain in the hands of the state or private owners. The Concordat was unveiled to France with an ostentatious mass, hosted at a refurbished Notre Dame on Easter Sunday 1802. But the Catholics were fuming. Only days before, Napoleon extended religious freedom to Protestants and Jews, despite the usual carping from the church. Response to the Concordat was mixed. Out in the countryside it was acclaimed, and reinstated parish priests were obviously happy. But among the legislature and the army, full of men who had struggled for years to reign in the church, well, they were less than pleased. Mandatory attendance, ordered by Napoleon, revealed these divisions. Victor Moreau ignored orders and literally puffed smoke at passing priests. Antoine Guillaume Delamare was booted out of Paris for reminding his compatriots of all the military lives lost in the Vendée, suppressing what was a Catholic uprising. The church too was put off by Napoleon's last-minute edits, the Pope now realising who wore the pants. Praise, however, was effusive from the 50 bishops and 10 archbishops who weren't going to do anything to jeopardise their state salaries. While the Senate was on board for the Concordat, the tribunate and legislative body took a lot of convincing. Lucien only broke down resistance and had the Concordat ratified in 1803. Half the reason Napoleon had been so eager to bury the hatchet with the church was so that they'd be an ally in implementing wholesale reform of the French education system. Long had the revolutionaries seen education as something of a silver bullet. The Constitution of 1793 specifically guaranteed state education to all Frenchmen, and various figures from Mirabeau to Condorcet to Lepeltier and Grégoire had taken cracks at devising a modern secular education system. Problem was that in the tumult of war and with the Republic staring down the barrel at insolvency, few of these proposals had ever seen the light of day. Now it was Napoleon's turn, and he was brimming with ideas. In keeping with his idea to instill some kind of moral direction for the people, primary education was to be the exclusive purview of the clergy, hence why he needed them on site. Children were to attend Sunday schools where they would be taught basic numeracy and literacy, and then given a typical Catholic education. This was how things had been done under the Austrian regime, and in that sense Napoleon's regressive plan ruffled many a feather. This was a trade-off, however, as after the age of 11, education would be taken out of the church's hands and become the responsibility of the state. To that end, 45 lycées, or colleges, were established in May 1802. Just like with Lepeltier's original national schools proposal, the idea was to train up the next generation: administrators, soldiers, politicians, and scientists. Every year, entrance exams were held for the lycée, and the 6,400 highest performing male students were given scholarships. Spots could be purchased too, provided the student passed the exams and was a boy. The educational regimen was comprehensive, covering, in addition to the usual fare of French and mathematics, philosophy, biology, physics, ancient languages, and foreign languages. This was to be an entirely secular education, administered by the departments and the prefecture. The success of these reforms encouraged the creation of more lycées, and even some copycats in Italy and Spain. To this day, some of the finest schools in Europe are French, and can trace their origins to these original Napoleonic reforms. Indeed, education was, and would remain, a topic close to Napoleon's heart. Elucidating in an off-the-cuff address at a meeting of the Council of State, he said that education was, quote, the most important institution, both the present and the future. Concurrently to his rapprochement with the church and reforms to education, Napoleon took a stab at administrative and legal reform in August 1800. It was an ambitious undertaking. The Austrian regime's eclectic assemblage of medieval laws and overlapping jurisdictions had been thoroughly overhauled by the revolutionaries. But there was still a great deal of work to do. Like with education, the needs of war took precedence, meaning that in 1800, France still had something like 42 separate regional codes, lingering on as half-implemented artifacts of the revolution. But this was still a solid base from which to start, and the goal, as laid out by Napoleon, was to create a single unified civil code that applied across all of France and her overseas territories. To write the code, Napoleon turned to Jean-Jacques Cambacérès, the second consul. There was no one better qualified. Not only was Cambacérès a celebrated jurist and legal scholar, but he'd already been involved in revolutionary reforms. A committee was formed to see him through this task, consisting of, among others, third consul Charles-François Lebrun, François Tronchet, Louis-Joseph Fauré, Félix Bigot, and Jean-Étienne Portalis. From July to December, this committee hosted 107 sessions, and by December 1801, unveiled the Civic Code. In 493 pages of vernacular, matter-of-fact French, the code spelled out pretty well anything you would want to know about how France was to operate. Just to name a few things, it covered civil rights, property, inheritance, marriage, citizenship, tax, banking, loaning, contract law, business partnership, altruism, warranty, bartering, and a whole lot more. Very much steeped in revolutionary ideals, the Civic Code ensured civil rights and personal liberties. It enunciated clearly the separation of church and state. Privilege by class was outlawed along with inheritance by primogeniture, so too was arbitrary punishment and arrest. Expanding again on old Lepeltier's work, the Penal Code decriminalized blasphemy, adultery, and homosexuality. Equality before the law, freedom of worship and conscience, the right to petition, a straightforward process for emancipation, and other similar rights were guaranteed. The stipulations of contract law were also clearly defined, as was the legal framework in which judges and lawyers could operate as per the Code of Procedure. All of these things were well and good, but in keeping with the idea that this was an end to the revolution, Napoleon was clear that this was a triumph for the political revolution, not the social revolution. Where the Civic Code touched on social matters, it was an intensely conservative document. The family, headed by the paterfamilias, was to be the basic unit of French society as per Napoleon's conception. Only men could vote, own property, or exercise freedom of movement. Women, in exchange for protection, were considered entirely subservient to men. Few legal protections were enshrined for women, and indeed most of what was written about women specifically stripped them of their rights. They could not vote, enter into contracts, or gain a divorce unilaterally. Napoleon's own biases were a major contributor to these laws, as evinced in a lengthy argument he had with Portalis. Portalis stated that divorce should be illegal because, he believed, the institution of marriage was derived from natural law, which could not be contradicted. Napoleon disagreed, stating that marriage derived from, quote, society and morality. Though he did worry that divorce, were it too easy to obtain, might become, quote, a national habit, it had to be legal, even if undesirable. Families, Napoleon argued, would be kept together by religion, only where that failed should the law intervene. Of course, this view of the family, as the basic societal unit, betrayed Napoleon's growing sexism. Quote, woman owes obedience to her husband. She must be instructed that on passing from the care of her family, she comes under the protection of a husband. This was, quite literally, a paternalistic view of how women ought to behave, informed by Napoleon's increasingly moralistic outlook. Things only got worse regarding workers' rights, which were laid out in the Civic Code and Commercial Code. A soft ban on strikes was implemented as workers were required to possess a logbook or a livret in order to get work. If they struck or were a known troublemaker, a worker's livret was either taken or suspended, and then they were just shit out of luck, unable to work legally. Employees, and the middle class more generally, were the true beneficiaries of the code. It wasn't all bad for the workers though. Their wages were as much as 20% higher as they had been during the revolution, owing to a shortage of labour. The point is more so that, stripped of protection, they were acutely subject to the vagaries of the free market. Notably, Napoleon decried the collectivism of the revolution, but did adhere to its guiding economic principle that, quote, wealth cannot confer privilege. But this was for cynical reasons, as described at a council meeting on August 13th. Napoleon believed that in order for wealth to exist, a poor underclass had to work, kept in line by religion. The sexism and social conservatism of the Civic Code is unconscionable to a modern palate. But taken in the context of its time, where basic protections for women and workers scarcely existed at all, to have even such weak and contingent ones as these ought to have some value. It's also worth noting that the Civic Code went a long way to knitting back together a French society divided by war and revolution. Certainly, when the finished package was passed by the legislature in March 1804, it was acknowledged as a crowning achievement, as much for Napoleon as for its framers. It was used as an inspiration or outright copied by many nations in the 19th century. To this day, a heavily amended version of the Code Civil des Français is in active use in France and several other nations. It is not without good reason that the Civil Code is more commonly referred to as the Code Napoleon. Napoleon chaired dozens of sessions wherein the code was framed, and was instrumental in having it passed by the tribunate and legislative body, who were initially very hostile. In meetings of the Council of State, Napoleon was similarly impressive. Meeting regularly at the Tuileries, seated at the head of a horseshoe table, Napoleon gave form and function to the debates of the council. Issues discussed touched on literally every aspect of governance. No detail, no issue was too small for Napoleon's attention. Meetings starting in the early afternoon could stretch on into the next morning, but Napoleon kept the councillors active. He was a dynamic presence that focused everyone. For example, after an exhausting 10-hour meeting of the council on the 21st of March, the one where they were discussing the provisions of divorce, Napoleon slammed the desk and exclaimed, quote, Come, citizens, wake up. It's only 2 in the morning and we must earn our salaries." That being said, Napoleon was not domineering. Far from it, despite being the youngest member of the meetings by far, he proved deserving of the same respect which he extended to his councillors. Hell, Napoleon's friends and councillors joked around with each other. One quipped that their general was taking too long at his meals, to which Napoleon joked that, quote, "Already I am corrupted by power." He was unafraid to appear ignorant by bombarding his councillors with questions or to have words clearly defined. He listened patiently and allowed everyone to say their piece. Reports were given a fair hearing even as they contradicted an official narrative. It was also not uncommon for Napoleon to talk to his opponents one-on-one or to take discussions after hours, debating by the fireside. A good portion of this success was down to Napoleon's intellectualism. He was willing to be challenged, to have his mind changed by the foremost experts in their fields. He hadn't stuffed the Council of State and their ministries with scientists, jurors, scholars, and bureaucrats for looks. He genuinely wanted the lively, constructive debates that would devise rational solutions to France's myriad problems. Of this, Napoleon said, quote, "For me, a man of the sword and of finance, not a jurist but a legislator, my opinions matter little. In an argument I may say things that 15 minutes later I disapprove of. I do not wish to appear better than I am." It also helped that Napoleon kept everyone accountable. He would swoop in unannounced and simply listen to debates. Other times he would organize and direct the discussion. Napoleon could recall details effortlessly, often astonishing the councillors with minute recollection of events from weeks or months prior. His questions were direct and to the point. Official minutes were concise and informative, if a little bit doctored. To keep things straight, Napoleon subdivided the Council of State into separate purviews for the army, navy, foreign affairs, domestic affairs, justice, finance, and administration. So though a dictator, Napoleon was every inch the enlightened despot. He expressed his philosophy quite succinctly on July 4, 1800. Quote, "My policy is to govern men as the greatest number wish to be governed. That, I think, is the proper way to recognize the sovereignty of the people." The problem here is that Napoleon thought he knew what was best for the French people, but at least he can't be accused of incompetence or laziness. It cannot be understated just how central Napoleon was in organizing Napoleonic France. He's not merely claiming credit for others' work. His was the driving force, the dynamic presence that injected the government with an intense verve and urgency. Not only did this benefit France legally and judicially, not only did it serve to bolster Napoleon's reputation as a lawgiver and peacemaker, it also created a new political centre. A political centre that no longer skewed left or right, as in the days of the Directory, but was tied inextricably to Napoleon's pursuit of order and his brand of enlightened despotism. Government ministries were staffed by men who had been at each other's throats in the years ago. Lazare Carnot, who briefly replaced Louis-Alexandre Berthier as the Minister of War from April to October 1800, had of course been a key member of the Committee of Public Safety, and had been on the wrong side of tussles with Napoleon before. Minister of Police Joseph Fouché was an old Jacobin turned Thermidorian. Ministers of Justice André Abrial and later Claude Régnier were both old-school liberals from the early days of the Revolution. Huguenot Maret, Secretary of State, had flooded in and out of favour since the Revolution began. He impressed Napoleon with a quick wit and sound advice. Let's not forget Minister of Foreign Affairs Charles-Maurice Talleyrand, who had been so shrewd as to side with the victors on several occasions. Some ministers were somewhat apolitical, owing their post-Brumaire appointments to Napoleon's trust and esteem. Here we have Minister of Finance Martin Michel Charles Gaudin, Lucien Bonaparte, Minister of the Interior, and later the chemist Jean-Pierre Chaptal in the same position. Denis Decrès, Minister of Colonial Affairs in the Navy, had impressed Napoleon during the Egyptian campaign. The Council of State was a similar story, full of men who had been political enemies only years before. Some had sent others' family members to the guillotine. To rally Jacobins, Royalists, Girondins, and Thermidorians, to put them under the same roof and have them pull in the same direction, was an incredible achievement. Napoleon's policy of ralliement had been a resounding success, and gained him the support of three broad groups of citizens, the ralliés. The first and most obvious group was the military. As a career soldier and war-winning general, Napoleon's status among the army had only recently taken some hits by reinstating the clergy. Apart from these minor quibbles, he was still beloved. Interestingly though, Napoleon often de-emphasized his martial support, assigning only a few military men to government and wearing mostly civilian garb. The second and third group of ralliés were both civilian, reflecting Napoleon's diverse base of support. Bureaucrats, lawyers, jurists, merchants, businessmen, mayors, teachers, civil servants, judges, accountants, and clerks, in a word, the bourgeois middle class, was the backbone of Napoleon's support among the French citizenry. These were career-oriented men focused on their next promotion or appointment, scrambling over each other to prove their loyalty and worth. As a rule, all were educated, literate, and politically active, and responded well to a first consul who, though a military man first and foremost, never neglected the administration of the Republic. It also helped that many had come of age during the Revolution, and saw in Napoleon a similar enlightened mind. The third group of ralliés we've seen, the old nobility and clergy. And these supporters weren't ride or die, even if Napoleon had gone out of his way to reintegrate them into French society after the Revolution. The old guard reciprocated with, if not outright loyalty, a general acceptance that Napoleon's was the new normal, and if that meant reconciling with old enemies, so be it. Some groups could not envision themselves folding into the new centre. Liberal opposition sprung up everywhere. Guebert-Meltier, our old friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, was one such rallying point for opposition after his release from a Prussian prison. Napoleon restored the, quote, honest Lafayette citizenship and offered him a seat in the Senate. This offer was rebuffed. Liberal opposition was strongest in the tribune and the legislative body. Pierre Darnoux, Benjamin Constant, and Marie-Joseph Chenier rallied opposition opinion, making it hard to finesse through the civil code. But political opposition was one thing, threats of terrorism and assassination were another beast entirely. Because let's be real here, Napoleon had plenty of enemies, and I don't just mean those in London or Vienna. As I said before, there were real hardcore Jacobins and Royalists who were truly irreconcilable to the consulate. They came in two flavours each. For the Jacobins there were the Babeufistes, who plotted revenge now that the social revolution had been well and truly shuttered. There were also those Jacobins who were dismayed at Napoleon, himself an ex-Jacobin, and felt betrayed that he closed the book on the revolution rather than write a new chapter. Then there were the Royalists. Unreconstructed Royalists were, apart from a few Orleanists, usually Bourbon legitimists. There was no chance they'd let bygones be bygones after the death of Louis XVI and his son Louis XVII. And Napoleon hadn't exactly been cordial in his continued exchanges with Louis XVIII, reminding him in a letter, quote, "You must give up all hopes of returning to France. To do so you would have to step over 100,000 corpses. Sacrifice your personal interest to the interests of peace." Other Royalists, on the other hand, were monarchists, yes, but largely insofar as it meant to return to the traditional role of the Catholic Church. Even with a concordat and a general détente with the Pope, militant Catholics were still keen to put a few extra holes in Napoleon and company. It must be stressed here that these Catholics are truly the most extreme of the bunch. Many Chouans from the Vendée had been so reconciled as to negotiate the concordat with the papacy on behalf of France. Napoleon was aware that there were crypto-royalists and crypto-Jacobins in government, all waiting in the wings. France had had several governments in only a few years, and it wasn't unrealistic to think that the consulate wouldn't last. Indeed, there were more than a few who were willing to spill blood to hasten the downfall. Several serious attempts to assassinate Napoleon took place in the months after his return in July. The first was foiled on September 4th, involving 17 conspirators. In October, a plot was uncovered to stab Napoleon as he exited the opera on one of his frequent visits. Later that month, several royalists were arrested for trying to bomb Napoleon's carriage. Some involving lone assassins, others requiring infiltration of the consular guard, and one to immolate Napoleon at Desaix's funeral, were all foiled. It was Joseph Fouché, as Minister of Police, who deserves the credit. Consular France was a police state, though not one maintained with terror, but rather by spying. His most high-profile arrest was of Alexandre Chevalier, who narrowly escaped the net after being implicated in a bomb plot. Chevalier then devised an elaborate system of simultaneously firing muskets. After exiting the opera, fireworks were to be set off to spook the horses during Napoleon's carriage. They'd blunder right into the fusillade, with caltrops strewn around to make rescue and escape impossible. The plan was foiled, arrests made on November 7th, and though Fouché was clearly on a roll, it was perhaps inevitable that one plot would slip through his grasp. On a cold Parisian night just after 8 p.m, Napoleon, Josephine, and their entourage were travelling to the opera, despite Napoleon's tiredness from a long day of work. Husband and wife rode in separate carriages to entertain their guests. Napoleon's was driven by coachman César, who, on this cold Parisian night, warmed himself with brandy. As the procession made its way down the Rue Saint-Nicolas, César made a brisk pace, driving the horses hard as he blitzed through the traffic. It was a fortunate thing. Just behind the coach, a huge explosion tore through the street, just between the two carriages. By his own account, Napoleon was awoken by the blast, and recalled being lifted from his seat. Lannes and Bessières, who were with him, joined with Jean Rapp from Josephine's coach to assess the damage. 7 were killed outright in the explosion, and 26 more wounded. Flaming debris was strewn everywhere. Young Hortense, riding with Josephine, was lacerated as coach windows shattered inwards. Napoleon never left his carriage as César was so drunk he thought the explosion was celebratory cannon fire or fireworks, and so scarcely stopped. Thus Josephine and company arrived at the opera mostly unharmed, albeit shaken by their near-death experience, to find Napoleon already arrived. He said to her under his breath, "Can you believe it, the bastards tried to bomb me." An electric mood was cast on the concerto of Haydn's oratorio, as the crowds applauded not just the performance, but the sang-froid of the first consul. The bombing had been a very near miss for Napoleon. Hidden in a barrel atop a horse-drawn cart was a bomb that, had it detonated when it was meant to, as the coaches were alongside, would have wiped out Napoleon and most of his family in one fell swoop. The masterminds of La Machine Infernale were quickly apprehended after some expert sleuthing from Fouché. They were shoehorned a lot of them, but Napoleon couldn't care less. Here was a golden opportunity to strike at the unreconcilable Jacobins. They were, in his opinion, because of a long experience with political organising, a far more effective and dangerous enemy than the Royalists. On Christmas Day, Napoleon labelled the previous evening's attack as an act of terrorism, exclaiming that, quote, "They want to attack the revolution by destroying me. I will defend it because I am the revolution." It pained Fouché to go after his old friends and allies, so he wasn't exactly thorough in his work. Of the 130 Jacobins arrested on January 8th, most were already staffing the government, and more than a few were already dead or long since emigrated. None were involved with the Machine Infernale. This was a purge, as Napoleon was quick to point out to men like Théophile Berlier, who stuck his neck out for the arrestees. Cruel and unusual punishments were forbidden by the Constitution, so the go-to method was exile to French Guiana, a death sentence in all but name, owing to European antibodies unused to yellow fever and malaria. Liberal opposition would never have allowed such an unjust punishment, so Napoleon went over their heads and had the Senate promulgate a binding decree, the Senatus Consultum, on January 5th, completely bypassing the legislature. For all his bluster about the dangers posed by Jacobins, Napoleon must have secretly realised that the Royalists were the more immediate danger. All the plotters of La Machine Infernale were guillotined without delay. Heavy-handed political repression of the Jacobins was followed by a slew of decrees aimed at imposing harsher sentences and strict military-style tribunals for capital crimes. With public opinion and the Senate backing Napoleon to the hilt, their opposition now to terrorism, even if it was misattributed, liberal opposition was broken and these laws passed quickly. Emboldened and empowered, Napoleon now turned the whip to the opposition. He couldn't outright purge them like the Jacobins, but he could essentially phase them out. In March 1801, new electoral laws were passed that, among other things, made it harder for liberals to get into government or the legislature. By early 1802, a weakened tribunate and legislative body were due to be renewed by a fifth. Napoleon intervened to have a majority of the liberal opposition ejected. Gone was Constant, Chenier, and Dannou. The tribunate was then cut down by 50 members and overseen by the Council of State. The legislative body took the hint, and thereafter both they and the tribunate were wholly quiescent institutions, and supported legislation to amend Napoleon's 10-year term as first consul to a lifetime appointment. For the most part, though, Napoleon relied upon the Senate to get his laws passed, namely with the Senatus Consultum. Like a proto-peerage system, the Legion of Honour was founded in May 1802, honouring officers and senators with a nice award and a plush salary. These policies would culminate in the Constitution of Year 10, which we'll get to in another episode. Though Napoleon was successful on the home front, peace proved elusive. For as decisive a battle as Marengo had been, delivering France-Italy, it had not proven enough to compel Emperor Franz II to submit. 2 days after the battle, Napoleon wrote to the Emperor saying, "I have the honour of writing to your Majesty to communicate the wishes of the people of France, so as to bring an end to the war that desolates our nations. It is on the battlefield of Marengo, in the midst of suffering and surrounded by 15,000 corpses, that I beg your majesty to listen to the cries of anguish. The arms of your majesty have covered themselves in enough glory and control enough territory. What reasons can your majesty's ministers allege for continued hostilities? I propose the Convention of Alessandria be extended to all armies, and that negotiators be readied on both sides. Alas, hostilities would continue. The Austrians had one last card to play. As we've seen, Napoleon's initial plan for the 1800 campaign was to have a great big pincer across the Austrians through Italy and Switzerland and meet up in Vienna or thereabouts. But in his obstinance, Moreau had insisted on a more conventional German campaign, and desperate to have some action to draw away Austrian forces, Napoleon hadn't interfered. This is not to say, though, that Moreau had been idle. Far from it, he'd added several more victories to his name. After crossing the Rhine in early May, Moreau's Army of the Rhine, numbering around 120,000 men, collided with the army of Feldzeugmeister Paul von Kray. Kray had at his disposal a similar number of Austrian troops, and several thousand regulars from the duchies of Bavaria and Württemberg, as well as a few other imperial states. Fighting at Engen proved indecisive, but the subsequent Battle of Stockach broke Kray's back. Moreau chased him all the way to Ulm, where at the Battle of Hochstadt, Kray was flattened. Like Melas down in Italy, Kray agreed to Moreau's armistice as per the Convention of Parsdorf. An uneasy peace now blanketed the German front. Moreau's reasons for agreeing to a truce were understandable. A cautious, methodical general, having studied and participated in previous failed German campaigns, he wanted to consolidate his position. It also didn't hurt that he was deep inside of Germany, aiding France's diplomatic position. Napoleon held out hope that this advance and Marengo would be enough to break Austrian resolve. Of course, that didn't happen, meaning a return to the offensive. Direct orders from First Consul Napoleon aroused Moreau. While in Italy, Guillaume Brun was held back by an unexpectedly stubborn Austrian defence, and Jacques MacDonald similarly delayed in the Alps, Moreau attacked through Bavaria on November 26th. Munich fell quickly. To prevent the French from consolidating along the Danube frontier, the Austrians themselves launched their own counter-offensive. Replacing Paul von Kray, Archduke John took command of the army. The French left flank was turned, forcing Moreau south. However, John overplayed his hand. Pursuing too vigorously against a patient opponent, he stumbled into a trap. Amidst the snow and smoke at Hohenlinden, not far from Munich, the French hit back. The battle was brief but decisive. Moreau chased the dejected Archduke back across the Danube, deep into Austrian territory. Napoleon was pleased that Moreau had won the German campaign, even ordering a gun salute from the navy at Calais and Boulogne, and then in early January, praising Moreau's, quote, skillful and beautiful manoeuvres. But for all the praise, it was abundantly clear that Moreau, an avowed Republican, was the only general who could seriously claim to be as good as Napoleon, now that Desaix was dead. Napoleon had initially planned to take command of the Army of the Rhine in November, hence why Moreau had been so keen to launch his own offensive. In later years, Napoleon would do all he could to downplay Hohenlinden and aggrandize Marengo. Nonetheless, France was better off for the win. Emperor Franz II was ready to sue for peace. It also helped that Austria was, in late 1800, diplomatically isolated, while France was going from strength to strength. To begin, relations between France and the United States had been ameliorated thanks to the steady efforts of Joseph Bonaparte. Negotiations with American diplomat William Van Murray concluded with the Treaty of Montefontaine on October 3rd, whereby the Quasi-War was ended. But the natural alliance between the two great republics of the Atlantic world had lost its sheen. It was not without some concern that the Americans watched the First Consul centralize power. Interestingly enough, though, Napoleon himself was a proud admirer of the United States and its late president, George Washington. Even as the Quasi-War was ongoing, Napoleon issued a proclamation to the French people on February 7, 1800. George Washington is dead. That great man fought against despotism. He established the liberty of his nation. His memory will be forever treasured by the French people, as it shall be by the free men of both continents, and especially the soldiers of France and America who together fought for liberty and equality. The First Consul therefore orders a national mourning for 10 days. A black shroud shall be draped across the standards and guidons of the Republic. Napoleon was a little late on this one. Washington had died 3 years earlier, almost to the day, but his feelings were genuine. He even ordered a bust of Washington sculpted and displayed in the Louvre, alongside one of Desaix and, funnily enough, old General de Gommier. Ending the Quasi-War with the Americans aided France in another major way, as it allowed Napoleon to successfully begin his long-planned colonial gambit. I'm not going to go over the details here, but instead when we look at the Leclerc expedition. What's important right now is that at the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, signed on October 6, 1800, France exchanged territory in Italy for Louisiana. Once peace was made with the Austrians, Tuscany would be handed over to the Spanish Bourbons and renamed the Kingdom of Etruria. The Empire of Russia too was making Tsar deals with the French. Claude Vaubois surrendered Malta to the British in September 1800, ending Russia's last real bit of beef with the French. In fact, Napoleon and the mercurial Tsar Paul found that they actually had quite a bit in common, namely their enemies. Paul had quit the Second Coalition fed up with Austrian meddling and British bungling. France no longer seemed like the boogeyman they once had, and a rapprochement was brokered, beginning with a series of cordial letters in the Tsar's own hand, addressed to Napoleon. Reflecting this about-face and policy, Paul then formed the League of Armed Neutrality, eventually including Sweden, Prussia and Denmark, who all agreed to cooperate to break Britain's stranglehold on maritime trade. Napoleon reciprocated these gestures, which opened up European ports to trade, by offering military assistance to the Tsar. It was proposed that André Massena might lead as many as 35,000 men to the Caucasus and from there launch a joint Russian-French invasion of India. In return, the Russians would support the French in Egypt. These and other plans went nowhere as in March 1801, Paul was assassinated. The exact details to this day are a bit murky, but it is known that an internal conspiracy, formed partly in response to the détente with France, felt compelled to take this drastic step. Alexander I, Paul's eldest son, took the throne, and believe me, we'll hear plenty more about young Alexander down the road. All of this is a roundabout way of saying that the Austrians were feeling the pinch. Vienna was on the cusp of siege, Italy was lost, and Britain a distant, distracted ally. On December 24th, the very day of the Saint Nicolas assassination attempt, Napoleon accepted an offer of peace from the Emperor. It was Napoleon's worry that the British might torpedo the peace process, but another reappearing Austrian, Count Ludwig von Cobenzl, assured him on December 31st that this would be a separate peace. Cobenzl undertook negotiations with Joseph. The final peace was signed on February 13th at Lunéville, a small city in Lorraine. Napoleon recorded in his diary, quote, "Peace has been signed on the continent, the terms those desired by the French people." Those terms offered to Austria were extremely generous, basically just a rehashing of the terms of Campo Formio. Napoleon had put Austria in their place twice now, and really didn't want to go in for a third punch-up. French territorial gains in Switzerland and the former Austrian Netherlands were confirmed, again. So too were those in Italy, again. Piedmont and Savoy were annexed outright into France, and the Cisalpine Republic reformed. Tuscany, which the Austrians sought to maintain, was handed over to the Spanish and reformed into the Kingdom of Etruria, as per the Franco-Spanish agreement. The Papal States were left untouched, and Naples was kept an independent kingdom, but both would play host to French garrisons. General Joachim Murat garrisoned the Neapolitan port cities of Brindisi and Taranto. On February 17th, a fete to celebrate the terms of Lunéville was hosted at the Foreign Ministry's offices at the Hôtel Gallifet. The host, Talleyrand, spared no expense, and the jubilant, heartfelt celebrations of all involved echoed the general sentiment across France and the continent. After 9 long years of war, with only ever a few months of respite before the bloodshed resumed, France and Austria were at peace. For Great Britain, the object of a decade of foreign policy, the containment of France, had crumbled like chalk. Their only advantage now was naval supremacy, but with a massive shipbuilding program and the opening of European ports to French trade, even this power was waning. Conditions were finally right for Britain and France to sheathe their swords.